terrified of her own shadow, because she believed it was trying to kill her. She was born beneath a sky of prophecy and expectation, the third child of Ferdinand and Isabella, the famed Catholic monarchs, heirs to a newly unified Spain. From her first breath, Joanna of Castile was told she carried the weight of empires in her bones. Not a girl, not a daughter, a future. And yet, even as a child, she felt something the court mistook for shyness, a creeping unease whenever she saw her own shadow stretch across the floor. Her tutors recorded it in quiet, embarrassed notes. The Infanta seems unsettled by darkness cast behind her. Her nurse would find her standing perfectly still in afternoon sunlight, turning slowly, watching the silhouette follow her with hesitant, suspicious eyes. Other children feared monsters. Joanna feared herself. She once whispered to a maid, "Why does it move when I don't tell it to?" The court smiled at her imagination. Her mother, Queen Isabella, called it sensitivity. Her father dismissed it as childish fancy. But shadows grow longer with time, and so did her fear. The palace remembered the first time Joanna screamed. It was during a lesson, a quiet afternoon in a sun-falling corridor. Light poured through the latticed windows, breaking into shards across the marble floor. Joanna, aged 12, walked beside her governess when she suddenly froze. Her shadow, stretched thin and distorted by the angled sun, seemed to lift its arm a heartbeat before she raised hers. A trick of light, a half-second delay, nothing more. But in Joanna's mind it was a betrayal. She gasped, stepped back, and the shadow, elongated, warped, seemed to lunge forward instead of retreating. She let out a cry so piercing the attendants rushed toward her, finding her pressed against the wall, trembling violently. "It tried to touch me," she whispered. "It wants me." The governess crossed herself. The servants murmured prayers, but whispers alone couldn't chase away fear this deep. From that day on, Joanna refused to walk alone at dusk. She demanded extra candles at night. She began sleeping with her face turned toward the wall, away from the flickering shape on the floor that she believed watched her sleep. But royalty cannot avoid shadows, not political ones, not personal ones, least of all the ones attached to their own feet. Years later, when she married Philip of Burgundy, beautiful, charming, and dangerously indifferent, that childhood fear returned with new teeth. For on the night she arrived in Flanders, exhausted from days of travel, Joanna stood in her new chambers as torchlight danced along the walls, and there, cast in trembling gold, she saw her shadow lag behind her movement by a fraction of a second. Not a supernatural event, not magic, but her mind, already strained by separation from home, her husband's coldness, the unfamiliar court, clung to that tremor like a prophecy. "It's waiting," she whispered. Her ladies-in-waiting didn't understand. Waiting for what? Joanna already knew. For when I am weakest. And weakness comes for every human, especially for a princess surrounded by enemies disguised as allies, a husband who preferred other women, a court eager to call her mad, and a mind fraying from lovelessness and isolation. The shadow did not come for her that night, but she believed it had already chosen its moment, and soon. The entire kingdom would fear the thing she feared most. Part 2. The Shadows of Flanders. Joanna arrived in Flanders expecting love. What she found instead was a court built on mirrors, whispers, and eyes that watched her with an intensity no warmth could soften. Philip the Handsome, the man she had been promised to, was precisely as the portrait showed. Beautiful, charming, intoxicating, and hollow. He kissed her hand with theatrical gentleness, but when he looked into her eyes she felt nothing behind his, not affection, not curiosity, just hunger. The kind of hunger that consumes applause, not people. But what shook her even more than Philip's indifference was the way the Flemish court moved. They walked like shadows themselves, attending, observing, judging. Soft footfalls, whispers in corridors, eyes tracking her like a rare specimen imported from a distant land. Joanna had grown up in Spain, a world of sharp sunlight and open courtyards, but Flanders was different. a place of low grey skies and halls lit by trembling torchlight, a place where walls felt closer, where corners felt deeper, where shadows were not swallowed by daylight, but multiplied by it. Her ladies claimed she was merely homesick. The courtiers claimed she was too emotional. Philip claimed nothing at all. But Joanna knew the truth. Flanders was a country where shadows lived longer than the people who cast them, and her own shadow. It had grown bold. The first night in her new palace, Joanna stood before a long row of windows draped in heavy velvet. The torches flickered behind her as servants prepared her chambers. She tried to steady her breathing, to imagine her mother's voice, her siblings' laughter, the familiar courtyards of Madrid. But then she saw it, the shape on the floor beside her, her shadow. At first it lay still. Then, as she stepped forward, it followed. But when she paused, it didn't. Her foot stopped over the cold stone floor. The shadow's foot landed a heartbeat later. Her breath caught. She lifted her hand in a trembling arc. The shadow's hand rose, but slower, not imitating, but anticipating. She stepped back sharply. The shadow stretched forward instead, elongating into something thin, unnatural, distorted by the angle of torchlight, but twisted enough that her mind could no longer dismiss it as mere physics. It felt alive, watching, waiting. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I know what you are." She spun, reaching for the nearest torch to flood the room with more light. Her ladies rushed in, startled by the sudden commotion. "Your Highness? What happened?" Joanna pointed to the floor, breath shaking. "My shadow." But when she turned back, the shadow lay flat and calm, perfect in every line, as innocent as paper ink. The ladies exchanged looks, the silent, pitying kind, the kind that says madness without speaking it. Joanna knelt, her hands trembling as she placed them on the stones. She leaned close, staring into the darkness that mirrored her form, and for the briefest moment she felt something stare back. That night she refused to sleep. She ordered every candle in her chamber lit. She paced until her feet ached. She sat upright in bed, her back pressed to the headboard, eyes fixed on the shifting gold cast across the floor. When her ladies begged her to rest, she whispered, "If I sleep, it will move first." And deep in the hallways of the palace, beyond the torch-lit chambers, beyond the marble corridors, the Flemish courtiers were already whispering, "The Spanish princess is not right in the head. Is she too fragile? Did the son of Castile ruin her mind?" But they were wrong. Joanna's mind wasn't ruined. It was awakening to a terror that would follow her from Flanders to Spain, from palace to prison, from youth to her final breath. And the first people to fear her mind would not be priests, physicians, or kings. It would be her own ladies, who began to confess quietly that when the torches flickered, they sometimes saw her shadow move when she didn't. Part 3. When love turned into a haunting. Philip the Handsome did not love easily. He loved beauty. He loved the thrill of conquest. He loved the mirror far more than any woman who gazed into it beside him. And Joanna loved him with the kind of devotion that becomes a wound. At first she tried to ignore the way he drifted from her, slipping out of her chambers before dawn, returning late at night smelling faintly of other women's perfume. She tried to believe the coldness in his eyes was simply political caution, not indifference. She tried to build a home in a land that whispered about her the way shadows whisper across walls. But love, when one-sided, becomes a kind of darkness. And Joanna's fear, the shadow that had stalked her since childhood, found new places to breathe, because Philip's betrayals did something to her mind. They made her watch him. They made her watch the women around him. They made her watch the corners of every room, her thoughts tightening like a fist. And slowly, her shadow became less frightening than something else. The fear that her husband was slipping away. The first time she confronted him, it was not with tears, it was with silence. Philip entered her chamber late, too late, boots mud-stained, hair dishevelled, smelling of wine and laughter that did not belong to her. Joanna sat alone beside a single candle. Her shadow lay long across the floor. She didn't speak, didn't rise, didn't blink, only watched him. It unsettled him more than any accusation could have. Her voice, when she finally used it, was low. "Where were you?" Philip scoffed. "A king goes where he pleases." "You are not a king," she whispered. "Not yet." The silence that followed felt like two blades crossing. He stepped closer, too close, and Joanna's gaze dropped to the floor, to his shadow, to hers. Two shapes cast across the stone, touching, merging. She recoiled as if burned. Philip frowned, unaware of what she saw, the way their shadows mingled unnaturally, the way her own silhouette seemed to stretch toward him like an accusation, or a plea, or a warning. "It follows you too," she whispered. "You just don't notice." Philip stared at her, unsure whether to laugh or leave. "Joanna, you must stop indulging these fantasies." But the word hit her like a slap. Fantasies. The court already whispered it. Her husband now said it aloud. A crack split inside her. That night she could not sleep. Not because of Philip, but because of the shadow on the floor beside her bed. It did not lie still. Whenever she blinked, even for a breath, it seemed to shift. A fingertip, a shoulder, a tilt of the head. Subtle enough to doubt, obvious enough to terrify. Her heart beat so loudly she feared it would wake the servants. She leaned forward and whispered to the darkness, "What do you want from me?" Nothing answered, but in her mind, beneath the layers of grief, suspicion, and humiliation, a sentence formed. "It wants what you cannot keep. Her crown, her sanity, her husband, perhaps all three." In the weeks that followed, Philip's absences grew. So did court rumour. So did Joanna's fear. Not just of loss, but of being replaced. Because each time she confronted Philip's lovers, slapping one, cutting another's hair, screaming until the entire palace trembled, she saw the same thing afterward. Her shadow, cast across the wall, looked thinner, sharper, as if fed by her rage, or feeding on it. At times she felt it tug at her heels as she walked. At times she swore it whispered her name. At times she found it in positions she had not moved into. Her ladies begged her to rest. Philip demanded obedience. The priest blamed the devil. Her father blamed the Flemish air. Her mother, proud, devout Isabella, blamed emotion. But Joanna knew the truth. The shadow was waiting for the moment her heart finally broke. And Philip. Philip was breaking it piece by piece. Part 4. The shadow that followed the corpse. Death did not come gently for Philip the Handsome. It arrived suddenly, indecently, like a door slamming in the middle of the night. A fever, a collapse, a final breath that left his chambers colder than any winter wind. For most queens, grief is private. For Joanna of Castile, grief became an empire. When she was led to his lifeless body, her hands trembled so violently, her ladies believed she would faint. But Joanna didn't collapse. She didn't scream. She didn't tear her hair or fall to her knees as the priest expected. She simply stared, not at his face, not at his ring, not at the crucifix placed atop his chest. She stared at his shadow, cast long across the floor by the candles surrounding his bier, still, perfect, unmoving, an obedient darkness, unlike hers. She leaned in, lips cold, and whispered, "You have no power over him now." No one understood what she meant. No one dared ask. In the days that followed, Joanna refused to bury him, refused to leave his side, refused to sleep in any room where she couldn't see his body. Chroniclers wrote she lay beside his corpse, holding his hand. Others wrote she kissed his cold lips. Others claimed she only slept when exhausted, wrapped in his cloak, whispering prayers until dawn. But all of them agreed on one thing. She watched the shadows constantly. Her ladies noticed first. Whenever a candle flickered, she stiffened. Whenever a torch guttered, she gasped. Whenever her own shadow brushed the floor near Philip's bier, she recoiled as if stung. She ordered the room lit with dozens of candles, enough to turn the night into a trembling sea of gold. She wanted light everywhere, except behind her. Never behind her. When the funeral procession was finally forced upon her, a political demand, not a personal choice, Joanna escorted Philip's body through the dark roads of Castile by torchlight. Each night she insisted the coffin be opened so she could ensure no one had harmed him. But the attendants noticed something else. At every stop she positioned herself so her shadow fell away from him, never near, never touching, as if proximity alone would taint him. One night, outside the convent of Santa Clara, a gust of wind extinguished several torches. The attendants scrambled to relight them, but in that brief darkness Joanna screamed, a scream so raw that nuns dropped their rosaries in terror. When light flooded back in, she was crouched beside the coffin, trembling violently, staring at the stone wall where two shadows stretched together in distorted shapes. Hers and Philip's merged. She pressed her shaking hands against the coffin and whispered, "You will not take him from me." Who she meant by "you" was unclear, but she wasn't speaking to the nuns, or the attendants, or God. Her eyes were fixed on the wall. When the procession continued through the countryside, Joanna forced the guards to keep a ring of torches lit around her at all times. She refused to walk without at least 6 flames between her and her own shadow, but shadows do not die with fire, and grief does not silence fear. That night, as she sat beside Philip's coffin, her head resting on the cold wood, she felt something brush against her foot. She froze, slowly looked down. Her shadow stretched beside her, elongated, warped by the flickering light. Its head tilted, her breath hitched. She didn't move, she didn't blink, she only whispered, "Not tonight, he is still mine." A moment later, a guard approached to ask if she needed anything. Joanna flinched, eyes wild. "Light," she hissed, "more light." Soon the courtyard glowed like a field of tiny suns, but no amount of flame could quiet what had awakened inside her. The belief that her shadow, her oldest fear, had followed her husband's corpse, and now wanted her too. Part 5. The prison where her shadow won. Tordesillas was never meant to be a prison. It was a monastery, a quiet fortress of prayer and stone. But for Joanna of Castile, widowed, isolated and unravelling, it became the place where walls grew teeth and shadows learned to whisper. Her father Ferdinand greeted her with tenderness that hid ambition. He embraced her, murmured condolences, and quietly ordered the doors locked behind her. A daughter turned into an inconvenience, a queen turned into a problem, a woman turned into a secret. He told the court it was for her safety. He told God it was his duty. He told himself she was too fragile to rule. But the truth was simpler. A woman grieving was easier to imprison than a woman reigning. And so Joanna, Queen of Castile, was left alone with the one thing she had feared since childhood, her own shadow. Inside her stone chamber, the light behaved strangely. Torches sputtered. Candles flickered. Sunlight crawled across the floor in shapes that felt too deliberate. Her shadow stretched differently each day, thinner, longer, melting into corners as if it were studying the room more than reflecting it. Her ladies noticed. They whispered in the corridors. "She stares at the wall for hours. She sleeps with the candles burning until dawn. She refuses to turn her back to the light." But no one understood what Joanna felt, that the darkness wasn't behind her, it was beside her, watching, growing, learning the contours of her fear. One winter storm cut the torchlines in the hall. Wind roared through Tordesillas like an angry prophecy. Servants sprinted to relight candles, but the shadows moved faster. When Joanna's chamber went dark, she screamed, a scream so raw and guttural that it echoed off the stone like an animal trapped in its own body. Her ladies burst in with torches, their light shaking in their hands. What they saw froze them. Joanna stood pressed against the far wall, nails bleeding where she'd clawed at the stone. Her eyes, wide, glassy, consumed, stared at her feet. Lightning cracked, and for a single white-blue moment the entire room illuminated. Her shadow stood inches from her, not stretched behind her as it should have been, not cast to the side by the torchlight, but directly in front of her, as if something had stepped between her and the world. Then the lightning died. The darkness swallowed everything, and Joanna whispered in a voice no larger than a breath, "It followed me here." From that night on, she begged for candles. Dozens! Hundreds! Light not to banish darkness, but to trap it, to keep her shadow from slipping across the floor, stretching toward her bed, bending into shapes she could no longer dismiss as tricks of the mind. Days blurred, nights stretched, years folded in on themselves. Visitors described a queen who scarcely recognized seasons, who paced in circles until dawn, who slept sitting upright to keep watch over the silhouette on the floor. Some said she had gone mad, others said she had been made mad. But one thing was certain. Joanna had become a ghost long before she died, not because of grief, not because of solitude, not because of politics, but because she no longer trusted the ground her own body cast darkness upon, the shadow she feared as a child, the shadow she watched twist beside Philip, the shadow she believed followed his corpse across Castile, was now the only companion left to her. And in the stillness of Tordesillas, in the final winter of her life, Joanna of Castile finally understood the truth she had spent decades trying to outrun. The monster she feared wasn't chasing her. It wasn't stalking her. It wasn't waiting for her weakness. It was her darkness, her grief, her inheritance, her crown. The shadow she thought wanted to kill her only ever wanted one thing: to replace the woman she had been. And in the end, surrounded by stone, candles, and silence, it did.